So I thought I would talk a little bit about, is it worth it to buy or rent? Because there's definitely been this understanding for most of our lives, right? That that buying is cost effective, or it's going to be a better financial decision than renting. So the first question I start with is like, why do you want to buy a house? What is your motivation? Are you buying specifically for financial reasons, or is it because it's going to enhance your lifestyle and this is where you want to live and this is the option that's available? Those are very, very different reasons. I had actually just seen the I don't know if you guys follow Your Rich BFF on Instagram. I love her. All right, it's just like a minute or two.
Oh my God, why aren't interest rates coming down? I'll never be able to buy a home. Why do you want to buy a home so badly? You're joking, right? If you're renting, you're an idiot loser who throws money into a black pit. Everyone says so. Who's everyone? Mathematically, it's smarter to rent than buy in all 50 of the largest US metros. Any money you'd save by renting, you could invest into other things. Well, Dave Ramsey said, I have to buy a house. Dave Ramsey is also a dinosaur. In 1990, when he was 30, the minimum wage was $3.80. In 2025, you're 30, and the minimum wage is $7.25. So the minimum wage has roughly doubled, but the median housing price in his home state of Tennessee back in 1990 was $58,000. In 2025, the median list price in Tennessee is $423,000. So wages have been multiplied by 2, but housing has been multiplied by more than 7. You see how the math isn't mathing, right? Wait, so I don't need to buy a home to be a real adult? If you're buying a home solely for financial reasons, especially just because someone else thinks you should, it probably doesn't make sense. And these days, buying a home is a lot more about wanting to paint the walls, put down roots, and build memories in one place, and that's okay. Not every decision has to be a financial one, but let it be known, if we're only looking at the numbers, no one would be buying houses. Don't get duped by financial gurus who are out of touch. I'm Vivian, your rich BFF, and your favorite Wall Street girly who has the financial credentials to prove it. If you want to learn more about your money, follow me.
This is the cost of renting versus owning. So let's see. So this graph is showing the gray line here is the average lease payment per year. And you see that it has gone up, but the slope of that growth change has basically stayed stable, right? But if you look at the red line, this is the average new monthly home payment. So basically from 2011 until, I don't know, we'll even say 2019 or 2020, even if we're being generous, then month to month, buying a house was cheaper than renting. Now you can see very clearly that a mortgage payment for the same type of property is going to be much higher, at least 50% higher. Interest rates were about 0% here. They'll never be that low ever again, like in our lifetime that we're aware of. Right? So yeah, interest rates are currently mortgage rates are about 6.8% right now. And when they say that interest rates are going to come down, it probably will, but maybe like 1%. So it'll be like 6.8 to like 5.8. But that's still not anywhere close to what the interest rates were during this period of time. If you look at the red line where it starts here, this was 2008. And so houses were expensive then as well, relatively, right? And then during the crash, the monthly payments came down because the cost of the house also came down, right? And then this is where they were like, okay, emergency alert, let's put 0% interest so that people can start buying houses again. So they did, and people started buying them because, paying 1 to 2% on a mortgage, that's amazing. that's like free money. So a lot of people did start to buy houses, and those people who bought in this range got a snag of a lifetime. But now those low interest rates also pushed the cost of houses up. So then the cost of the house went up, and now the interest rates are also high. And the interest rates may come down 1-2%, maybe. I mean, unless we go into another like depression, I don't think that we're going to see, near zero interest rates again. Also, though, I don't think that economists think that was a very smart decision, because it messed a lot of stuff up, keeping them that low for that long. And then there was a stat that every 1% increase in interest rates can add $250 a month to your mortgage on a $350,000 house. So if your house costs more than that, if your house is like a $750,000 house, it's going to add, every 1% adds $500 a month, right? That's a lot. But it's not enough in the other direction to bring it down to less than the cost of renting, I guess. We'll just go through a couple of these. So house prices rose 27% since 2020. So they also cost more now, in addition to interest rates being higher. This is the current mortgage rate. And then it rose from 2021 from 3.1 to 6.9. That's a lot. That's a lot. And in like pre-2020, it was even lower than this by a little bit. This was, a little bit lower. Whereas rent increases average 5%. If you can buy a house that maybe has like a granny suite or an ADU or a room in the basement that you can rent out, what you're doing is you're now having that asset that you purchase also provide income. And that changes the game completely, because now you have an income producing asset on your hands. So that does change the game. But you would basically want to say, okay, if the room is going to provide me an extra $500 a month, then I've reduced the mortgage by that amount. Is that still less than buying or more than buying? So what actually goes into a mortgage? So yes, there is the interest rates that that make the cost more, but there's also additional costs. So the first one we already talked about was the principal and the interest. So you've got the cost of the house and then the interest cost. So the principal is increasing and we have the interest increasing, which means the whole payment is going to go up. But then when you're buying, you also have closing costs, and closing costs could be 2 to 5% of the loan, and when you're talking about, an expensive house, that's a huge chunk of change that you could be investing, or you could be putting towards rent, and then there's also property taxes and insurance. So yeah, as a renter, you do have renter's insurance, but that's like $18 a month versus homeowners insurance is like, we're talking hundreds, $100, $200 a month, depending on where you live, because it's also much more expensive to insure a house, in Florida or California, than it is, in the Midwest or something. But it does depend on where you are. So you need to make sure that you understand how much the insurance is also going to cost when you do that. And then property taxes. Oh my gosh, cannot understate how much people do not take into account the property taxes. If you're living in a high property tax state, this is where it can get really expensive. And so the property taxes may start out low, but as the value of your house appreciates, right? So you're trying to build that equity, your property taxes also increase, which eats into some of that appreciation. I I would say that the build of the equity is definitely more than the cost of the tax increase, but I was just talking to another friend the other day, and she had bought a house, and she had renovated it, and she loves that house. She's put a lot of work into it and everything, but she's kind of on like a limited budget, right? And the value of her house went up, and she was like, oh, this is great. Except then the city sent her a tax bill that was much higher. And they're like, well, yeah, and now you owe us more money, even though you don't actually have that money. And so this is actually causing a lot of homeowners who have been in their houses for 10, 20, 30 years problems, especially people on fixed incomes, because they're like, well, I bought this house when it was $100,000 and now it's $500,000. But I don't have the money for that. So how am I supposed to pay this extra property tax bill when my income hasn't gone up, right? So you do own the house, but the city and the state still tax you on it, which means it's not really yours. You're basically now renting from the government. And then there's also mortgage insurance. So if you put a down payment on the house that's less than 20%, you also have to pay, like, it's basically a penalty. You have to pay an additional mortgage insurance. I pulled a random condo from Brooklyn. It was a $2 million condo, and this was the estimated payment pulled from Zillow today. And so the principal and the interest is $10,000, and then you've got $1,000 in property taxes, $600 in insurance, and then $400 in HOA fees. We hadn't even talked about the HOA fees. So if you're in a place like New York or almost anywhere these days, you have a homeowners association that also has fees, and they also tend to raise their fees over time as well. And sometimes they raise them and it's a lot more than you expected. The numbers that I pulled, that was for a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo, like 1,000 square feet. So it's not like it's giant. So that's just your mortgage payment is going to be more than your rent payment. But then when you buy a house, then there's these like surprise expenses. So depending on when you buy the house, you might have to replace the roof. That's really expensive. Your HVAC might go out, and then you have to replace that. You might need a new dishwasher, a new fridge. You might need a new washer dryer. It might not come with a washer dryer. You might need to replace the deck because it's it's falling apart. You're also responsible for all of the like yard maintenance, the landscaping, the mowing of the grass, all of that, which as a tenant, you would not be responsible for. So it's also just a lot of work as well. It's opportunity cost of your time fixing all that stuff. So I like to say when you rent, your payment is the maximum you'll ever spend because you won't have any of these weird expenses, nothing, your taxes won't increase, your insurance won't really increase, you can't have surprise HOA fees. I think the only thing that increases is the actual percentage increase of rent, but that's also doesn't change drastically anymore as well, because most of these rents are also set by like AI rent things. I mean, maybe not if it's just like an individual landlord that you have a relationship with, but like in apartment buildings, the rents are just set by algorithmic settings. So, but when you own, your mortgage is actually just the beginning. It's the floor. And then that's the floor. And then you could spend more than that. Whereas rent is basically the ceiling of the amount that you'll spend. So let's say you sell a house. Okay. So you've got the equity in the house, right? And you're like, yeah, let's get this equity out. You sell it for, let's say you sell it for $350. Well, maybe you've put $60,000 into equity in the house through your mortgage payments. So now you still have a $290,000 remaining mortgage. Well, you still have to pay the realtor fee, which is like 5 to 6%. So they're going to automatically take 20,000 of that. Then you've got the closing costs. Then you've got, the repairs and the staging to make it look nice before. And next thing you know, you're left with 27,000 of the original 60,000 equity that you thought you had in it. It's good, but it's not good for short term, for sure. The only way that you would really want to flip a house quickly like this is if you're putting sweat equity, and this is like your work, and you're putting investment into this property, and you've got some deal with a realtor so that you don't have to pay these large commissions, and you do all the closing, you're doing all the repairs and the staging, so you're not paying for that. That's how you can make money on the flip of a house. But for most homeowners, you're not going to do a lot of that yourself. So it really eats into the proceeds. It also depends on how long you're holding it, right? So the closing costs, the staging, the realtor commission, those are all going to stay the same pretty much. So let's say you have, you've held it for 30 years. Well, now you'll probably have 100% equity. And so now when you sell it, it was, you might have paid $20,000 in fees, but over 30, you're averaging that over the 30 years that you held it. So it ends up being worth it, right? But if you try to do this every 2 years, there's so many people, that are like, oh, I moved to New York, I bought a house. Then my job changed 2 years later. And so I moved to San Francisco, and then I bought a house there. Oh, and then I decided I didn't like it there. I wanted to move the country. And so 2 years later, I moved there. Every time you do that, you're paying these huge fees to do that. Okay, so an example of when this was a good idea. So this graph, let's say 2014 started over here. So in 2014, let's say there was a house that cost $150,000. They bought it down here for $150,000 at 4.25% interest. So their monthly payment would be $928 for a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house. So this is the homeowner versus renter burden. So we're on this blue line of the homeowner. So let's say that homeowner's down here. Man, they really got a steal. They got a good interest rate. They bought when housing prices were low, blah, blah, blah. Then 2020 hits. Interest rates start rising. Now it's getting to be a lot more expensive. So this is the percentage of your income that is spent on housing. So now if you try to buy a house, it's average, I guess that's supposed to be 35% of your income is spent on homeowner housing versus 29% for renters. So let's say this house now, it's 2025. So if you tried to, this was a real example of a house. So if you tried to actually rent that house now, the rent would be $1,800 a month. So renting the same house today would cost double, basically. Okay, well, let's say you wanted to buy that same house today versus what you could rent it for. A mortgage today would be $2,300 versus the $928 that you got in 2014. So that's 23% more than renting as well. So not that great of a deal. But what you did here is you bought low and you got a low interest rate, and now you basically locked in this low rate. The thing that's happening now, house costs are high, right? So people that do a fixed mortgage now, they're locking in a very high rate. So what a lot of homeowners are doing now who want to buy houses for, lifestyle reasons, as we discussed, they're getting these mortgages with the expectation that they will refinance when the rates come down. But as we just said, refinancing also costs money because you have to pay for the closing costs, and you might have to pay for, we didn't even talk about this expense, but an appraisal for somebody to come in and find out how much the house actually is worth, things like that. So there are expenses that go into refinancing. So you don't want to refinance all that often, but if you lock in a mortgage at this rate, you would financially want to refinance this when interest rates are lower. This was actually a very recent graph. It's interactive, actually. I can send you guys the link, but it's a map of where it's cheaper to buy a home than to rent. But I will summarize this by saying that all of the major metro areas, so like LA and San Francisco, Miami, New York City, those areas, even Raleigh, where I live, the light blue is that it is cheaper to rent in all of the major metro cities. The dark blue is where you see it's actually cheaper to buy than to rent. But if you zoom into those areas, they're more rural areas. They're more, single family home, residential, commuter areas. They're not the cities. And so if you zoom into New York here, you would see that it's mostly cheaper to rent, but it is slightly cheaper to buy a home in the outskirts, like way out in Long Island, and some in the upstate, and then a lot in rural Florida. But every decade or every generation, there's like a really great, investment opportunity that if you can jump on it, you're going to make good money. And for that generation in the post, financial crisis era, with the low interest rates, lots of people did jump in on that because they saw it, they were able to, and they locked it in. That was their investment opportunity that probably paid off for them, right? But we have another opportunity. We can buy another asset now that we know is going to increase and appreciate. And so we have our appreciating asset. There's a lot of people that are saying, Bitcoin is basically digital real estate because you're actually literally buying real estate on the blockchain, right? So you're saying this little piece of block here is mine. I'm saying that's mine and I'm holding it. And if you want it, you have to pay me rent, essentially. And so that's our version and our generation of real estate, because the actual real estate we've been pretty priced out of now. So now Bitcoin is affordable for us. And that's why I'm so passionate about it now, is because it's I know it seems high, but it's still at such a low early price that with so much appreciation possibility, but this is such a great opportunity for people, for Gen Z and millennials who got, quite frankly, fucked in this whole real estate situation, to make some money so that then they have some assets that they could just buy that house in cash if they want to. When buying actually makes financial sense, there are some calculators where you can say, okay, this is what I pay for rent, this is what a mortgage would cost. Is it cheaper to buy or rent? And have it on a you get a little slider that you can slide it over the time to see how much more it's costing you to buy than to rent, and what the what the cutoff is for how long you need to stay there for it to basically make up for all of the transaction costs and the additional interest and all of that, right? But typically, like if you ask a realtor, they'll say you should really not buy if you're not sure you're going to stay there for at least 5 to 7 years at a minimum. But if you're one of those people who's like, oh yeah, I'm buying and I don't think I'm going to leave for 15 years, then it might actually make more sense. The other one, which we talked about, is just like, is it cash flowing? So is it actually producing income to offset those costs? Then you might be able to justify the cost of the house if you are house hacking or Airbnb-ing out part of it. And then the other one is just real estate as an investment, right? So if you kind of going back to what we talked about last week about money, why is money has to be a good store of value, right? So if you store your money in something that holds its value for a long time, that's been real estate for a lot of people, is because it is scarce and it's sturdy, like the land isn't going to go anywhere. You're not worried about it running off away from you, and so it's a good place to keep your store of value over a long period of time. So if you can find a good deal or a good situation where you're like, this is good real estate, it's in a very scarce environment like New York City, but I'm getting it at a discount. That is key though, because it doesn't matter if you buy it and then, the value goes down, you actually lose equity. So that doesn't make sense. You don't want to like buy it at the top, which essentially is kind of where we're at. To counter that, what's not a unique location value? Like places that are flooding, places that are in drought areas, wildfire areas, those are not durable locations, right? Because they could fall into the ocean or just burn up any day now, right? And then it's not exactly scarce if you're buying like out in the country, right? And I mean country, like in the Midwest, like in farmland. I mean, people don't buy that property. It doesn't really appreciate in value because it's not scarce. There's a lot of that land out there that nobody really wants. So if you can buy in a place that people want to be in, and that property or that real estate is scarce and it's durable, then it might make more of a financial sense, I guess. I did want to explain, or I guess talk about like leveraging the real estate. So let's say, for example, you buy a house for $100,000 and you mortgage it. And that was, let's say, 5 years ago. And, you're making payments on it, but the value of the house increased. Let's say it's $120,000 now. So now you say, oh, well, I have more equity in the house. How can I use that? Well, you can get a HELOC, a home equity line of credit, to say, okay, there's some equity that's built up in my house. Can I actually tap into that? And can you give me money? And you can get a HELOC. So that is very valuable if the house appreciates. In the last 3 years, real estate hasn't really appreciated much. So you kind of missed, if you had bought the house 3 years ago, expecting for it to give you a return on this opportunity to take a HELOC out and get some money out of that equity, you wouldn't be able to. And we need to touch briefly on debt. This is a big thing because when you take on a mortgage, you're taking on a big piece of debt. You're basically saying, I want to buy that property, but I don't have any of the money to buy it. I'll give you like 20% of the value of it, and you're just going to give me the rest of it and an IOU, and I'll just pay you. I'll pay you back over time for this asset that I can't even afford right now. So that is debt, right? But there's bad debt and there's good debt. Yeah. So debt, I really want to drill this into everybody's mind that debt isn't bad. Just bad debt is bad. And there's a very big difference between the two. It's more about how comfortable you are with the idea of good debt, of holding good debt that, you know, you're basically leveraging to build more assets or to appreciate. So good debt would be something like getting a large mortgage for 4.25%. This is great debt because it's low interest, right? My general thinking around this is if you can get debt for less than the cost of inflation, that's essentially free money. You're arbitraging. You're saying, well, the value of my cash is actually declining 3 to 4% per year. So if I can borrow money and then pay 2% per year on it, then I'm actually making money. Might be hard to understand, but so let's say you take out a loan for 2% interest, okay? Like at the low interest rates, when interest rates were low. You took out a loan for 2%. I took out a loan and the interest on that was 1.29%. So basically, I was paying 1% per year in interest to basically not pay that money and to pay that money later in the future. So every year I'm paying 1% and I'm paying 1% and I'm paying 1%, right? So let's say, for example, instead of doing that, I had just taken the cash and paid it in full and not taken on that debt. If I had paid it in full, I would have taken all my cash, I would have put it in, right? And now I'm not able to arbitrage the difference between how much, yeah, this is kind of hard to explain. So every year, your money is inflated. So the dollars that you hold inflate. So the value of it goes down, right? So it goes down 3 to 4% per year. So if you're paying 1% per year, you're only losing 1% per year. You're basically earning the difference between the 4% inflation and the 1% interest rate. So you're kind of earning 3%. Then there's the opportunity cost of that. So if you are investing that money is actually growing. It's not actually losing value. Now it's actually growing at 10% per year. Got that money growing 10% versus if you had just paid the money up front, you wouldn't be able to invest that money and it wouldn't earn that 10% return. And then if you're paying a 1% interest on it, you're basically just saying, well, by taking on this debt, I was able to invest this money at 10%, but I'm paying 1% on this loan. So you're actually netting 9%. But then you have to add in inflation. So you subtract the 3 to 4% inflation. What do you have? You have 6%. So inclusive of inflation and the return and the interest, you are net positive. You're still gaining money every year by taking debt. Versus, this is where bad debt comes into play, because if you take on credit card debt, let's say, you know, you're buying your Taylor Swift concerts on your credit card and you're buying burritos on buy it now, pay later. You're basically financing your entire life and you've got credit cards and you're paying, average would be like 15% on credit cards. So if you're paying now 15%, for that to be financially worth it, you would have to guarantee that you are going to earn more than 15% on that money that you're keeping invested. Also, if you are not investing the spread and you're just spending it, then that is even worse, because you have to basically say, what is the opportunity cost of the money that I would have spent? You're either investing it or you're spending it, the spread. So that's why credit card debt is considered bad debt, because most people are not earning more than 15% on the other money, or they're not investing the difference at all. So if you would have paid $10 for your burrito today, but you're like, well, I'm going to pay 10.20 tomorrow for it, and instead the difference, I'm going to just put that $10 into an investment portfolio. No, most people aren't doing that. They're saying, oh, I'm just going to spend that $10 on something else right now, and I'll just pay that later. But what are you going to pay it with? Now you have to pay it back and more, and you don't have more money. You have less money. This is why it's two completely separate areas of debt. Bad debt is technically like anything that's at a very high interest rate, like credit cards, or depreciating assets. So you're buying things that lose value over time. So cars are an example, although cars are, cars are the one thing that's kind of in that in-between zone where I'd say, you kind of have to buy a car because you have to like get around, right? But you don't have to buy $100,000 truck, unless it was a business expense, right? You could buy a modest car. But for you to justify buying this $100,000 truck, you're going to have to say that somehow that's an investment, that you're going to make more money because you spent all this money and you financed it, but most people don't. So it depends on what asset you're buying. Is it depreciating quickly, or is it, just doing its job? Yeah, I know this one's a little confusing. This is why it's important where you're investing the money that you're taking on the debt. So a house, right? Let's say you wanted to buy a house now, and you're going to pay 6.9% interest on the mortgage. So you're borrowing money at 6.9% interest. What you're actually buying, the investment, rather than paying for it in cash, right? You're buying this house, and the expectation is that the value of the house will increase. If the value of the property does not increase more than 6.9% per year, it would be technically bad debt, as in you are net losing money on that every year, because the interest you're paying on that property is more than the return on your equity. But if you can get a property that is in an area that returns more than 7% per year, or you get a lower interest rate, then that's why like the 4.5% interest is good, because it's essentially sort of keeping up with the pace of the property valuation. I think on average, homes appreciate like 3 to 5% per year, but that's like on average. And obviously in 2021, it was a lot more than that. So it's definitely something to consider. And this is why renting can be a better choice, because now you're not taking on debt to pay for your housing in the future. You're just paying for it now because the property can't appreciate. Versus, I want to borrow money from my property at the mortgage rate, let's say 6.9%. And why did I decide to take on this debt? I mean, there are a lot of people, and this is, contrarian in some circles, and this is just smart business moves in other circles. So it depends on, your comfort level with debt and your understanding, and your understanding of why it's a good business decision, I guess. I decided to take on this debt because I know that the money that I get from that debt will earn me greater than a 6.9% return. It's basically like I'm borrowing from my house to make a business investment. So I would say the same thing about business loans, right? So a lot of people go to the bank because they have a business idea. They want to open a restaurant. They want to, start a massage parlor, I don't know. But they need the capital for it. So they go to the bank and they're like, well, can I borrow money? This is my business plan. I expect to have, 15% profit per year. And they're like, okay, great. We'll give you a loan for 6% then, because you're going to be able to pay that 6% back with interest. And the business owner is still going to make more money. This is how most businesses are started, right? Well, most businesses that require startup capital. Usually that's good debt because you're making an investment in your business or in yourself. This is why student debt is also good debt or bad debt, depending on the return on investment. So generally we say that borrowing money to invest in education for yourself is one of the best debts to take on because it pays such huge dividends. But is it good debt if you borrow lots of money, but you're not able to pay it back? And it actually just eats into the opportunity of you investing elsewhere in things that actually do make a return on yourself in some way. But this is really, we're just talking financially, because having an education pays off dividends. Like even if you study philosophy, which may not make a lot of money, right? It's going to pay dividends in your quality of life or, your passions or whatever, right? And that's valuable, but you can't pay the bank back with passion, right? So that's why I'm saying that's more of like bad debt. So you really have to know when you're borrowing that money, what do you expect the return to be? If you expect the return to be greater than the interest you're paying on it by even a margin of 2%, 2% would be enough to borrow money. But in my case, I'm saying, hey, I see an opportunity to buy an appreciating asset here that's for sure appreciating between 30 to 70% over the next 5 years. That absolutely beats the interest on a 7% loan. So if I borrow the money now, right, and I invest it in another asset that makes a return of 30% or greater, then I'm able to pay that loan back with interest and still make like over a 20% return. So it's just business, just numbers. You don't necessarily want to pay off your low interest debt when you have assets that are basically paying for that interest. You get into trouble when you're paying interest on something and your assets are now declining or they're losing value. Now you can't really pay that interest back with your investment. Bigger picture thinking, when we talk about the 1% and everybody else, what are the 1% rich people doing? They do not sell their assets. They buy assets, then they cash flow that asset in some way, either by, I have a house and I have tenants who are going to pay me money, or I have Bitcoin and I'm going to take a loan against it for cash. And then they take that money that they borrowed against or the cash flow from the tenants, and then they take that money, they go buy another asset, and then they take a loan against that asset, and then take that money to buy another asset, and then take a loan against that asset. I mean, it sounds a bit weird if you aren't used to it, but this is just what people with money do. They buy assets, and then they borrow against them to buy more assets. And this is why they are so rich. That's really the only reason. And when I say buying assets like real estate or Bitcoin, also businesses. Rich people buy businesses and they have them cash flowing for them, and then they borrow against that business, or they sell the business and then they could go buy more assets. So yeah, they buy houses, real estate, mostly commercial real estate, right? Or, rental properties, or businesses. Okay. Let's say you buy Bitcoin with a 0% interest credit card or whatever, right? Now you still will own interest on that. But let's say it's 1 year and now Bitcoin has appreciated, and now we have this additional value of this Bitcoin asset. Now you can use this asset to take a loan against it to pay back the other interest. If the value of your asset continually goes up and up and up and up, you can always borrow against it to pay back the interest. Coinbase has an option where you can get a loan against your Bitcoin. Unchained also has the option to do that if you custody your Bitcoin with them. And then there's another company called Ledn, Ledn. So it's safe to do as long as you're not taking a loan out for 80% of the value, right? You're taking a loan and saying, well, the value of this is $100,000. Can I just borrow $20,000 or $30,000 of that to go pay off this other debt or whatever? Live your life. You're not borrowing 90,000 out of that 100,000 that you have. So if the value of that ever dropped, you would still be, within reasons. So let's say you have 1 Bitcoin. They're saying, okay, if you have you send us 1 Bitcoin, we will give you 48,000 US dollars, up to that much. And then you would pay 12.4% interest. But then when the value of Bitcoin goes up, now they'll give you 50% of whatever 1 Bitcoin is valued at in the future. This is an example. So they said, okay, you have 1 Bitcoin and you're going to use that as collateral. That allows you to borrow $45,000. So people are borrowing against their Bitcoin to get US dollars, and then they're using those US dollars to buy more Bitcoin. So now they have 1.495 Bitcoin. Then Bitcoin appreciates, providing you with a gain of $74,000. Then you sell that 0.495 Bitcoin, you repay this loan, and then you still have $28,000 left. So there's kind of like 2 camps of like what to do with your Bitcoin, because some people are saying, well, we should use it. We should be spending it, buying, selling, da, 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 da. There's other people that say, well, you should just hold it forever and just use it like real estate, and then just continually use it as a line of credit to fund your life. And then there's no tax implications of borrowing it. So you don't have to pay capital gains on it. Let me give you an example on a much larger scale that businesses are doing right now. Because you go to businesses are all the first ones to be doing some crafty finance deals. But Riot Platforms is a Bitcoin mining company. We've come full circle, guys. So they hold, almost 20,000 Bitcoin, valued at 1.8 billion. They hold it on Coinbase. So they took a $100 million Bitcoin-backed loan. And they're using the money to fund more business operations and growth. Yay. Probably to mine more Bitcoin. So then the credit line is scheduled to mature in 1 year's time. So this is very unlike other HELOCs, right? So they're expecting you to pay back that interest in 1 year. A key difference between this loan and say like a mortgage. So if you refinance your house, right, you have your mortgage payment goes up, right? When you take a Bitcoin backed loan, you do not have to make payments on it. You're taking the money, there's no payments, It's like a 0% interest credit card, but at 12% interest. But you're saying, I'm not going to pay it off in the year. It matures in 1 year, and now I have to pay all of that interest 1 year from now, plus return the money. But you can extend it. So essentially, you just then borrow more money to pay back the interest from the first loan. And to bring it back to an even bigger scale, this is exactly how the US government operates. The US government never pays back its debt. It always borrows more money to pay back the interest from its prior debt. So as long as the assets are growing, the US is getting into trouble because it's borrowing more money faster than the economy is growing. And that's why the US is getting into trouble. We aren't productive enough. Our investments are not giving us the return on investment that we are using. So it's turned into bad debt because the investment, aka Americans and their lives, are not actually returning enough value, essentially, to justify the debt. If you want to know how to get rich, I'm giving you all the tools. It's up to you if you want to use them. I feel a little passionate about because I realize that nobody knows these things, and I know that it scares people to think about like our 0% tolerance for debt people, and it's not your fault. You've been basically programmed to think that all debt is bad and you shouldn't have it, and that it's like the Dave Ramseys of the world. And that is really true for people who are really bad with money, right? Like, you don't really want to give a credit card to somebody who doesn't understand money, right? But the more financial literacy you have, the more you're educated on how the system works, the less likely you are to get fucked over by it. And instead you can just play the game and benefit from it. And the thing I love about Bitcoin is changing the entire game, because a lot of people realize that most people are completely cut out from this game. And normal people cannot get loans against their assets like this, or they can't they don't have access to certain financial tools, right? Because they're not advertised, or you have to have a certain credit level, or you have to have a certain dollar amount of assets before they'll lend you anything. They have to be certain types of assets, et cetera, et cetera. But Bitcoin means you can now buy Bitcoin. It doesn't matter who you are, where you live, how much money you have, and someone will give you a loan just by owning this Bitcoin. No questions asked. And it's instantaneous. When you get a loan off Coinbase, it's delivered to your account in minutes, and you can spend it within 15 minutes. None of this like, oh, well, we've got to do some paperwork, and we've got to, do assessment of the house and appraisal to make sure that it is the value that it is. And then we got to do some underwriting. We got to make sure that that the rental income that you say you have is what you have. I mean, it has taken me a month to go through this process to get some money out, to get a loan against my house. So it's not quick, very liquid liquidity, right? It's kind of stuck. It's tied up until somebody gives me permission to take that money out. So with Bitcoin, instead, if you just hold it, you actually have a lot more financial flexibility, because they're building tools around this. They're building lending platforms. They're building payment platforms. I mean, they're building an entire ecosystem around this new asset class, which is completely digital, which works a lot better for our generation. It's allowing anyone to get access to this type of wealth if they would so like to take advantage of it. You say, okay, I borrowed 40, let's say you have one Bitcoin and you borrowed 48,000, and then you went on your grand safari, and then 1 year from now, Bitcoin is doubled in price, which is a reasonable expectation. So now the value of your Bitcoin is doubled. So now you just take out another loan for $75,000 to pay back that original loan. And then that $75,000 loan is then due 1 year from that point in time. It just keeps cycling like that. This is just an example. It says, okay, you get 48,000. I mean, you can just take out 20%. You could just be like, I just want to borrow $5,000 or $10,000. And it's much easier to do. So to bring it back to, should you rent or should you buy? I couldn't go down that path without talking about, hey, this is an asset. And a lot of the questions I think come from, well, should I rent or should I buy? Because it's an investment, or it's going to be a cash flowing asset. And I mean, to be honest, at this point, your benchmark should be against Bitcoin. Bitcoin's return is now the benchmark. This is what I'm hearing on like every podcast, all the macro investors, like everybody in the business world is saying, well, when I make a business decision, whether to invest in something, I say, is the return on investment greater than just holding Bitcoin? If it's not greater than just holding Bitcoin, then I don't do it. I just hold the Bitcoin. So if you're trying to decide, well, should I buy a house as an investment or Bitcoin as an investment? If that's strictly the reason, then it would make more financial sense to buy Bitcoin rather than to buy a house. However, there are always other reasons to buy a house. Some of it could just be, balancing stability or wanting to live there, hands down. But if you were to invest in the Bitcoin now and then give it a couple years, you might just be able to buy whatever house you want in cash. And there's an entire financial ecosystem currently being built around Bitcoin. In 5 years, our entire payment rails, how we buy things, sell things, how we get loans, it's all going to look different, and we're not really sure how that's going to look. And but I think that you have options. You can either treat it like a store of value and simply an asset that you hold and you use as collateral to take loans against, if that feels good to you, or you can use it as a medium of exchange and actually buy and sell Bitcoin and use it to pay for goods and services and houses. And that's also an option. So basically, over the last 100 years, the stock market on average has returned about 10% per year, right? So with Bitcoin, it's going to be much higher because we're talking 70% returns in the next 5 years, right? So if you have Bitcoin, we're just estimating that the return on your investments, if you kept them invested versus investing it in a house, the benchmark annual rate of return is about 29%, let's just say. It's a rough estimate, but honestly, you can play with those numbers if you want based on how you think your investments will perform. But that's what we're going to use because I think that that's pretty reasonable. So then you can see, okay, based on how long I've held it, how much does it cost per month, basically? And it includes the opportunity cost, right? So this is the opportunity cost of if you had just invested it instead of buying the house. So for this particular situation, renting will always cost less. You could save $6,500 a month, which is significant. That is not like a difference of $50 or $100. And that difference gets greater and greater, as time goes on. After 25 years, you could have saved a lot of money per month. Let's just say after 3 years, you're still saving $5,600, $5,400, $5,800. Renting will always cost less. But if you're like, hey, I really want to live upstate and we can't find a rental that we like, or we really just want to paint the walls and demolish it, and we want a project, this is the life that we want. That's a lifestyle choice, and that is a perfectly acceptable reason to buy something. It's your money. You can do whatever you want with your money, right? Buying a house shouldn't always be a financial decision. I think for millennials, there really has been, we kind of grew up with this idea that you're only successful if you bought a house, right? Like that, like if you didn't buy a house, that you didn't like make it, And I think that that's a mindset that we just have to let go of, because it doesn't necessarily mean that, right? And we could be way more successful. And if we had bought a house, then maybe it was a bad financial decision. And like, we're just bad with money if you buy a house. I mean, it kind of looks like that. If you buy a house for financial reasons, maybe you don't understand money. And then 2008 to 2019, like for that decade, the post-financial crisis decade, that is the case. It was the better financial decision to buy at that time and lock in a low rent for 30 years. Yeah, when I run the numbers now for any house in the city, it does not make sense. Like the Airbnb market is really suffering right now, actually, because or like the people who would buy properties and then put them on Airbnb, it's not really working out for them anymore because it's so expensive. Their mortgage on that property is more than the rent that they can make from Airbnb on it. With the whole cost. So like people are really pulling out of the Airbnb business, Airbnb still makes sense. I mean, you can always use your asset to make more money off of it for sure. But as a business decision, you wouldn't go buy a property right now with the intent that you're going to turn it into a cash flowing Airbnb. You're a bit disillusioned. Like you don't see those ads online anymore, like start your new Airbnb business, because you can't make money in it anymore. And this is right now, but let's say interest rates drop again. Like now you guys know if interest rates drop, you'll know, oh shit, I should try and buy a house. So yeah, for businesses or houses or whatever, yeah, why, I think it's the same with buying a house of like, okay, well, I just want the house because I just love it, and it works for my lifestyle. And also businesses, like, do I want to take on a business or do I want to keep a business that is providing income for me, but it's not working for my lifestyle, and I know that I could actually just make better money elsewhere. So yeah. So this was pretty much my end slide. I thought it would be fun you can use the rent versus buy calculator if you were considering it. And then we can all enjoy the rest of our Friday. That is all, my friends.